The night leaned heavy over the diner like a lid on a dying ember, wind needling through broken neon, and snow sifting sideways, like ash. The woman sat folded into the brick with a blanket that had once been blue, and was now every color of weather. Her breath came thin and counted, as if she were keeping time with something only she could hear. Inside, the diner lights burned without welcome, and outside the world kept walking past her, as if she were part of the cold itself. Even the stars kept their distance. Tonight felt endless and bare. She had learned how to disappear without leaving, how to take up the smallest amount of space. Even when the night pressed close, her hair hung dark and wind tangled, and the skin beneath her eyes carried stories she never told aloud. Somewhere far from here, a river still knew her childhood name, and on colder evenings she whispered it into her sleeves to remind herself she had not always been invisible. Once there had been a man who promised shelter, then closed the door when trouble learned her face. That sound still lived in her bones, louder than hunger. Across the street, a horse stamped once and breathed a ghost into the air, and the man holding the reins stood as if rooted to the pale earth. He had meant only to pass through for coffee that never came and a little heat before the long ride back to his empty cabin. His coat was dust-colored, and his silence older than most towns. He had built a life of fences and forward motion, and very little looking back, yet something in the shape of the woman against the wall slowed him like a hand laid on the chest. He could have kept walking, and the winter would have agreed with that decision. Without comment, he told himself stories of distance and danger, and the way kindness can sometimes demand a man give up what little control he thinks he owns. But the wind cut sharper, and the woman folded further into herself, and he felt the stranger ache of another person's suffering echo in his ribs. Before he had words for it, he crossed with slow steps, as if entering shallow water, and the night seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere a clock ticked once, then stopped. Listening, when he spoke, the sound startled even him, the words slipping out before thought could fence them. "You're freezing, come home with me." It was not an offer polished for safety, only a raw statement shaped by cold and impulse. She lifted her face enough for him to see the fear living there beside pride, and the pride was older and harder to move. No one who has learned to survive by shrinking accepts warmth without measuring the risk. First, snow slid between them like a thin white question, and they both waited for the answer to choose a shape. She stood slowly with the care of someone used to being watched and judged and misread, and the blanket slid from her shoulders like a tired wing. He did not reach for her, and that small mercy weighed more than any promise. The horse shifted, and the reins whispered, and from the doorway of a closed shop an old man tipped his hat once. Without comment, a blessing made of silence, they began to walk with a careful distance between them that neither rushed to close, and the woman matched his stride, without trusting it and without fleeing it either. His cabin waited at the edge of open land, where wind learned new names. For loneliness it was small and stubborn and warm from the fire he had banked before riding into town. He filled a kettle and turned his back as it sank to boiling, and left a bowl of soup on the table with both hands, as if setting down something living. She remained near the door, at first absorbing walls and light, and the strange safety of not being told what to do. When she sat, it was on the edge, as if the floor itself waited. They ate without speech and learned the sound of each other breathing, and that was enough for the moment. The heat loosened the ache in her fingers until she hid her hands in her lap, ashamed of how they trembled when warmth returned. He noticed, and said nothing, which was a first kindness that felt like choice instead of charity. Outside, the wind tried every crack and was turned away by flame and timber, and a quiet agreement neither dared name. Night deepened and stitched their shadows to the same wall without asking permission, as if fate practiced restraint tonight. When she finally removed her gloves, the skin beneath was red and raw and mapped with small white scars that spoke of winters that did not care who you were. He averted his eyes, not from disgust, but from an instinct older than language that said, "Do not take what is not offered." She rubbed her hands together as if trying to wake them from long sleep, and a single sound escaped her, not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, more like the ghost of both. She covered her mouth, and he turned the kettle back on and pretended. The fire settled into a steady breathing, and the storm worried itself thin against the walls. She did not ask how long she could stay, and he did not say how long he would allow it, because both knew answers could turn shelter into debt. When sleep finally took her, it came sitting upright, wrapped in borrowed warmth, a traveler resting between miles. He watched the fire and felt the shape of his life shift by a single degree, the smallest measurement that still changes everything. Somewhere under there quiet, he recognized the danger of wanting and the deeper danger. Days lengthened softly after that night, the fire becoming a second sun that learned their shadows and kept them from drifting apart. She moved through the cabin like a guest at first, quiet as snowfall, learning where light pooled on the floor and where the board sang. He watched from doorways and corners, not guarding but witnessing, as if bearing proof she was real. They shared meals and weather and silences that grew less afraid. The snow eased its grip, surrendering fields inch by inch, and something in both of them thawed with it quietly, without fanfare or sudden declaration. She learned his routines, the way one learns tide patterns or the habits of birds, by watching without touching. Dawn found him saddling before the sky decided on color, and dusk carried him back smelling of hay and iron and distance. She stitched torn gloves and set bread to rise, and never assumed the work made her belong. Sometimes he spoke of fences, and sometimes she spoke of rivers, and everything else rested in the space between. Trust did not arrive as certainty, but as repetition, day after careful day, through gestures too small to misinterpret or fear alone together. The past crept closer as the weather softened, emboldened by comfort the way weeds love broken ground. One evening, as rain whispered along the roof, she told him about the first man, the one who had offered winter and delivered wind. Her voice stayed level while the story bled through it, the casual betrayal, the door closing with the sound of final judgment. He did not curse the man or promise revenge, because neither would heal what had been taken. He only said he was sorry and meant it with his whole unguarded chest that surprised even him that night. After that, the air between them shifted as if truth had altered its pressure. She slept lying down for the first time, stretched toward the warmth without apology, and he lay awake listening to wind scold the eaves. The wanting he had buried beneath labor, and land stirred like an animal testing the fence of his ribs. He feared it as men fear storms that promise change. A neighbor rode by and joked that she would leave once the ground dried, that all travelers do. The words lodged like splinters, and would not be shaken loose from his mind ever. He began to speak like a man preparing for loss rather than love, dropping careful hints about towns with work and rivers that led elsewhere. She heard the change at once because abandonment teaches its students to recognize the lesson early. Her hands grew still at the mending table, and her eyes lowered with an old familiar distance. Neither confronted the threat directly, yet it lived between them like smoke that seeps through walls without invitation. That night she dreamed of doors and woke before dawn with taste of iron on her tongue and decision hardening behind her eyes. She packed in silence as snow began falling again, light as mercy, heavy as memory. The borrowed coat slid from its peg without sound, and the small bag filled with the few things that were hers by history, if not by possession. She left a folded blanket and the gloves she had mended as offerings rather than apologies. Outside, the cold accepted her without question, loyal as ever. She walked toward the paling edge of the field where the land widened into uncertainty, each step steady, each breath pulling farther away from the fragile warmth she dared not trust anymore. He woke to absence the way one wakes to injury, stunned first and then throbbing with awareness. The chair was empty and the fire thin, and the space she had begun to claim stood cold as promise broken. He found the gloves and understood everything without needing more words. The neighbor's joke returned with cruel precision, and he knew what his caution had cost him. He rode hard into the new snow, following nothing but the ache in his chest and the faint thread of her footprints unraveling toward the open. Fear chased him faster than the horse ever could. He found her where the field met the sky, a pale line between what had been and what might yet be. Snow clung to her hair and shoulders, and she stood as if carved out of motion itself, ready to become only past again. When he called her name, it surprised them both because he had never spoken it before. He told her he was afraid of wanting what he could lose, and ashamed of trying to decide her life in the name of protection. The words fell rough and honest, and too late and exactly on time at last. For a moment she did nothing, and the silence widened until it held every unanswered goodbye she had ever swallowed. Then the strength she had carried alone for so long finally trembled and folded in on itself, not in defeat, but in release. She did not run back to him as someone rescued, but stepped toward him as someone choosing. Her tears froze on her lashes, and he lifted her hands without claiming them, waiting still for consent as if it were the only currency that mattered. The storm eased as if even the sky were listening for her answer. She nodded once, and the field breathed again. The return walk held no haste, yet every step felt like crossing a boundary no map could show. At the cabin the fire welcomed them with the same steady patience it always had, and this time she stood close enough to feel the heat as her own. They did not make promises carved in immortal language, but settled into the harder vow of daily choosing. The snow melted faster after that. Spring did not burst in all at once, but arrived the way healing does, uneven and stubborn and real at last. Time gathered around them like a slow river, and learned their combined reflection. She laughed more easily, and he learned the art of stillness beside another heartbeat. The town noticed without announcement, and the old shopkeeper smiled as if a silent wager had finally paid. They planted a small garden behind the cabin and argued gently about rows and sunlight, about how much space hope requires to grow. On warm nights, she told him stories of the people she had lost, and he listened without trying to stitch the grief shut. Some wounds need air to close at their own. When he finally asked her to stay in a way no road could undo, he did it without kneeling and without fear dressing itself as command. The question was quiet, barely louder than the fire, but it carried every season they had survived side by side. She answered him with a steadiness that came from choosing herself as well as him, and the walls of the cabin seemed to ease outward, as if making room for the future. They planned nothing grander than tomorrow, yet tomorrow began to look like a country they might fully enter together at last. So they married beneath open sky with dust for carpet, and the hills standing witness in their quiet endurance. Her dress was simple and borrowed, and carried the scent of clean cotton and courage, and his hands shook when he spoke her name into the wind, as if offering it back to the world. No crowd gathered, yet the land itself leaned closer. The old shopkeeper brought bread, the neighbor brought awkward blessing, and the fire waited at home to receive them again. She crossed the threshold this time without looking back, and called it hers at long last in truth. Years folded outward from that day like pages too tender to rush. The cabin learned children's footsteps, and the field learned the names of both their joys and their arguments, neither one unbearable anymore. She never lost the memory of cold, but it became a story she controlled rather than a shadow that ruled her. He never lost his fear of loss, but it learned to live alongside devotion instead of ahead of it. Sometimes on winter nights they still sat near the fire and listened to the wind fail against walls, and they understood what survival had given them.